It started at Sunday dinner, under the polite clinking of silverware and the soft bragging tone my family saves for themselves. I sat at my parents' table, the good table with the candles that only come out for holidays, and I listened to them congratulate each other for being smart, respectable, successful. I let them enjoy it. I knew what I was about to say. I told them I had used my entire savings, $38,000 I built dollar by dollar over years of saying no to new clothes, no to weekends away, no to help from them to buy what they call my grandmother's useless bee farm. I told them the deed was in my name now. I told them the hives, the shed, the cracked porch, all of it belonged to me. They laughed. My mother laughed first, a careful little laugh like a cough she didn't bother to hide. My father laughed next, louder, like this was cute. My sister Avery tilted her chin and smiled without warmth. I didn't hear support in that room. I heard entertainment. They thought this was temporary. They thought I had finally given them a story they could tell later. Remember when Lila burned 38 grand on dead bees? I watched their faces and memorized them. They think bees don't pay mortgages. They think I'll crawl back embarrassed and grateful. They think in a year they'll be able to stand behind a market table somewhere, hand out my honey like it's theirs, call it our family brand, pose for pictures, soak in praise, and treat me like the quiet labor in the background. They don't understand what I'm willing to do to make sure when the blue ribbon is lifted, it has only one name on it. Mine. You are listening to this story from the beginning, and what time is it now? Stay with me, and you'll see exactly how I turned their mockery into my revenge. 2 weeks before that dinner, I stood at the edge of my grandmother's property, the wind cold enough to sting through my sleeves. The "for sale" sign leaned crooked in the ground, the paint already chipping. It looked as tired as the house behind it. Grandma Rose Whitaker had been gone for only 4 days, and already my parents were talking about closing the chapter. They meant selling everything she owned, her farmhouse, the hives, the fields of dry grass where clover used to bloom. To them, it was just property value, a line in a ledger to be cleared. But for me, it was where I had learned that patience could hum louder than any ambition. The memory of her was everywhere. The porch still carried the faint scent of honey and smoke from her beekeeping suit. I could almost see her hands, small and steady, holding a wooden frame heavy with bees. She used to let me watch the queen move, whispering, "See her, Lila? Everything depends on her calm." Those summers were the only time I felt seen, not as someone's daughter or sister, but as myself. Inside the farmhouse, dust had settled on the photo frames. Her handwriting lingered on recipe cards and scraps of notes. Add thyme, not sugar. Let the bees lead, not the market. Each word looked alive, stubbornly refusing to fade. Mom called that morning, her voice brisk. She said keeping the farm would be a waste. Dad added that no one wants to deal with dying bees. Avery had already looked up a buyer, some company that wanted the land for storage units. Their decision was made. I hung up before I could cry. There was a heaviness in me that wasn't grief alone. It was recognition. I knew if I let them sell this place, I'd lose more than walls and soil. I'd lose the only piece of history that hadn't been rewritten by them. I drove back to the city that evening and opened my savings account, $38,000, every paycheck I had guarded from bills and pity. I withdrew it all the next morning. The teller asked if I was sure. I said yes. I didn't explain that I was buying back a ghost. The lawyer at the county office didn't ask questions either. He printed the forms, watched me sign under the column marked transfer of ownership, and stamped the paper with a heavy thud that felt like both an ending and a beginning. By dusk, I was back on the road, driving behind trucks loaded with hay, my car filled with boxes, and the sound of something new taking shape in my chest. When I reached the farmhouse, the sunset was bleeding orange over the hill. The windows were dark, but I left them that way. The silence inside wasn't cruel, it was waiting. The kitchen smelled faintly of wax and lemon. I opened cabinets that hadn't moved since childhood, found the chipped mug she used for tea, still stained at the rim. On the counter sat a tin labeled Queens. Inside were a few dead bees, perfectly preserved. Their bodies gleamed under the light, as if refusing to dull. I walked outside, the grass tall enough to brush my knees. The hives behind the shed were gray and brittle. A few lids had caved in, and the boxes had been chewed by time. Still, I stepped closer. The air was still, but when I leaned in, I heard it, a faint vibration. It was barely there, a hum softer than a whisper. Something alive was inside. The sound crawled under my skin and straight into my bones. It didn't feel like a haunting. It felt like a call. I placed my hand on the hive, and the warmth beneath the wood pulsed back, steady and deliberate, as if the earth itself was breathing. Tears burned the back of my throat, not from sadness but from the shock of hope. Grandma Rose had always said bees remember kindness. Maybe they remembered me. Maybe they had waited for me to come back. I sat down in the dirt until the stars appeared. I didn't know what I was doing, or how I would make any of this work. But I knew what I couldn't do: let them erase her. Let them sell her life as scrap. The hum grew louder when the wind passed. It wasn't a sound anymore. It was a heartbeat. And for the first time in years, I realized I had one too. Morning broke in thin streaks of gold across the cracked windows of the farmhouse. The frost on the glass shimmered like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to start again. I opened Grandma Rose's old beekeeping journal, its pages curled from years of honey-stained fingers. Her handwriting was steady and unhurried, every note more like a whisper than an instruction. I read until my eyes ached. I didn't understand half of it: pH levels, brood frames, nectar flows, but I traced every word as if meaning would seep through skin to bone. By noon, I realized I needed more than memory and stubbornness. I needed a teacher. That afternoon, a knock came at the screen door. Mrs. Jenkins stood outside, wrapped in her brown cardigan, the same woman who once brought me cookies shaped like flowers when I was small. Her eyes held that sharp, unblinking kindness that never allowed self-pity. She didn't ask how I was. She just looked at the empty hives behind me and said, "Thomas Hale still knows his way around bees. Find him." Then she walked away. I didn't question how she knew I would listen. The next day I drove into town. The hardware store sat between a laundromat and an auto repair shop, the kind of place that smelled like sawdust and rust. Behind the counter stood a tall man with sun-marked skin, silver hair tucked under a faded cap. His name tag read T. Hale. He didn't smile when I introduced myself. I told him I was Rose Whitaker's granddaughter. For a moment, something flickered behind his eyes. Surprise, maybe, or pain, but it vanished quickly. He said he'd worked those hives for 20 years. Then he added, almost like a warning, "The Collins family never cared much for bees." I told him I wasn't like them. I told him I bought the place myself. He didn't laugh, but his silence carried doubt sharper than words. He kept stacking shelves as I spoke, and I realized I would have to earn more than his attention. I told him about the $38,000 I had saved, the nights I'd eaten noodles so I could keep another $50 untouched. When I said I used it all to save the farm, he finally looked up. "You really think money will keep them alive?" he asked. "No," I said, "but I think belief might." For the first time, something softened in his posture. He rubbed the back of his neck and muttered that belief doesn't fill hives either, but he agreed to visit once. When Thomas came the next morning, his boots left wet prints on the porch. He walked the property without speaking. He tapped each hive with the back of his hand, listening to the hollow echo. Finally, he stopped near the far fence where clover grew in thin patches. "They can come back," he said almost to himself, "if you work honest." That became his rule: work honest. He showed me how to light the smoker, how to move slow so bees wouldn't feel threatened, how to listen to the hive's rhythm before touching it. My first attempt ended with a sting so sharp it made me drop the frame. I wanted to curse, but Thomas only nodded. "They test you first." Days blurred into weeks. My hands lost their softness. My back learned the weight of labor. I found a rhythm: wake at dawn, feed the colonies, scrape mold from the wood, record notes by candlelight. At night I'd fall asleep to the faint hum outside, the sound of life rebuilding itself. Sometimes Thomas would linger after work, writing in a small notebook. He never said what was inside, and I didn't ask. Silence between us wasn't empty. It was a language we shared. One evening, he brought over an old wooden box. Inside were frames from my grandmother's last season, still holding traces of honey so thick it caught the light like gold glass. He told me these bees were bred from a queen line Rose had started decades ago, known for endurance. If even one of those queens had survived the winter, he said, the farm could live again. Hope and fear tangled in my chest. We built new hives beside the pond, using reclaimed boards Thomas salvaged from town. He worked without complaint, hands steady, steps slow. When I asked why he was helping me, he said, "Your grandmother believed in patience more than perfection. I owe her that lesson." That night, after he left, I sat on the porch watching fog crawl up from the meadow. My arms ached, but it was the kind of pain that proved something had been done right. The farmhouse no longer felt empty. It felt expectant, like a held breath waiting for spring. Weeks later, Thomas and I opened the first hive together. The air buzzed with a low vibration that lifted the hair on my arms. Inside, a single queen moved across the frame, alive, golden, deliberate. Thomas nodded slowly. "Your grandmother would have approved." The sun slipped behind the trees, leaving streaks of amber across his weathered face. I didn't cry. I just stood there, breathing the same air that once carried Grandma Rose's laughter and realizing that belief, when given enough work, could sound a lot like resurrection. By late summer, the air over the property felt thicker, sweeter, heavier with work. The hives were no longer silent boxes along the fence line. They had a pulse. When I walked past them in the morning, I could feel movement in the air like heat off asphalt. Thomas said that meant they were strong. I wanted to believe that meant I was getting stronger too. There is a moment beekeepers never forget, and I understand it now. It is the first real pull. The first time you lean over a frame and see capped comb the color of late sunlight, sealed by thousands of tiny bodies that trusted you enough to keep building. I lifted one of those frames with both hands and felt its weight drag at my wrists. That weight was proof. Not memory, not inheritance, not hope. Proof. Thomas stood nearby while I turned the frame slowly, watching the way the light caught the edges. He didn't have to say anything. Acceptance lived in his silence. Approval lived in mine. The extraction was slow, messy, and nothing like the polished videos online. Honey clung to my fingers, to the table, to my shirt. The old hand crank extractor we found in the shed rattled like it might shake apart. The air in the kitchen turned warm and floral, and for a second it was like the house was breathing again. I thought about my grandmother, but not in grief this time. I thought about what it meant that her work was still feeding mine. I filtered the honey through clean cloth I had boiled in a pot, because there was no budget for anything more professional. I lined jars along the counter, mismatched glass I had scrubbed and labeled. I wrote the name by hand in careful, even letters. Rose Ridge Honey Co. Under it, smaller. In honor of Rose Whitaker. I wanted people to know I wasn't selling a souvenir. I was continuing a line. It wasn't beautiful branding. It wasn't corporate. It looked like what it was. A small operation held together by stubbornness and borrowed equipment. But seeing those jars lined up in rows across the counter did something to me. I had lived so long being the afterthought in my own life that I didn't know how to recognize pride when it arrived. Thomas loaded the boxes into his truck, and we drove to the Saturday farmers market in town. That market had always felt like background noise to me, growing up a place for tomatoes, handmade soap, and people with folding tables pretending their hobbies were businesses. This time, I wasn't walking through it. I was in it. We set up near the edge, under a canvas tent that faded from white to beige years ago. My hands shook when I arranged the jars. I kept lining and realigning them so they would look intentional, controlled, real. On one side of the table, I laid out tasting spoons I'd bought in bulk. On the other, I placed a small laminated card with the words raw local honey. I had no marketing pitch beyond honesty. For the first 20 minutes, no one stopped. People drifted past us carrying bags of peaches and flowers, talking about school supplies, weather, renovations. My heart sank into my stomach. I had spent so much that I didn't have, and the fear of being ridiculous pressed in on me from every direction. It felt like standing on a stage that no one had asked me to walk across. Then, a woman paused. She was older, with careful hands and a face that looked like it had lived through every kind of weather. She lifted one jar, tilted it toward the sun, and watched the slow ribbon of amber inside. She tasted a spoonful. She didn't smile at first. She just closed her eyes. When she opened them, she nodded once and said it was real. Real, that was the word she used. She bought 2 jars. Then she brought back a man who bought 3 more. He said something about how store honey never tastes like this because store honey tastes like sugar and shortcuts. I felt my throat tighten in a way I couldn't swallow past. After that, people didn't just pass by. They gathered. They pointed. They asked about wildflowers, about strain, about, is this really from here? The table filled with hands. Money changed hands. The cash box grew heavier. Somewhere in there, the fear let go of me. This wasn't charity. This wasn't someone patting my shoulder and telling me my grandmother would be proud. This was product. This was value. This was strangers deciding that what I made had a place in their kitchens. I felt something in me sit up straight for the first time. Mid-morning, a girl lingered near the back of the table. She couldn't have been more than college age, maybe younger, with ink stains on her fingers and a ponytail that looked like it had been pulled up in a hurry. She read every label twice. She wasn't browsing. She was studying. When I asked if she had a question, she told me her name was Riley Stone. She said she was in an environmental science program and had been trying to find someone in the county still keeping small batch bees without flooding them with chemicals. She said she'd never actually seen it in person, just in articles and lectures. She didn't ask if I was hiring. She asked if she could show up and work. She said she wanted to learn. For a second I couldn't answer. The idea that someone would come to me for knowledge felt unreal. I had been the one begging for it every single day since I reopened that door. Thomas watched the exchange from the shade of the tent. His face gave nothing away, but I could read him better now. His stillness was approval. His lack of interference was permission. Riley left with a jar and a notebook full of scribbles. I stood there and realized something important. The farm wasn't just surviving, it was beginning to matter. We stayed until noon. By then, the rows of jars had thinned to gaps. My back ached, my hands were sticky, my shirt was streaked. I didn't care. Every dollar in that cash box felt like a vote against the version of me my family had written in their heads. The drive back to the farm felt different from every drive before it. The land didn't look abandoned to me anymore. The porch didn't look like a relic, it looked like headquarters. The house looked less like a tomb and more like a workshop. When we unloaded the empty crates, I lined up the few remaining jars on the kitchen counter. I stared at them, not like trophies, but like witnesses. I understood then why power scares people who never expected you to have any. It isn't loud, it isn't dramatic. It's calm. It's the quiet moment when you can prove you don't need their permission to go on. For the first time, I knew the risk had shifted. The danger wasn't that this would fail. The danger was that it would work and that the people who had laughed at me would smell that success and decide it belonged to them. The first frost came early that year, and the air smelled like iron and wood smoke. Honey season was over, but the shelves in my kitchen were lined with gold. Every jar felt like a sentence in a language I had finally learned how to speak. Riley labeled them while humming to herself, and Thomas mended frames near the window. We had found a rhythm that felt like a small, living heartbeat, one that didn't need approval from anyone outside the farm. Then the article came out. It wasn't much, just a short feature in the local paper about women reviving heritage agriculture. There was a picture of me and Riley standing in front of the hives, the light falling warm across our faces. The writer had called our story inspirational. It didn't feel like that to me. It felt like proof we'd survived something private. 3 days later, my phone rang. It was my mother. Her voice had that careful brightness it always wore when she was pretending to be proud. She said she had seen the article online, that she had shown it to my father, that they were so impressed. The word impressed sounded rehearsed, like a line from a presentation. My father got on the call next, talking about potential, about scaling, about strategic growth, words that didn't belong to bees or soil or sweat. Avery, of course, was the one who followed up with an email. She wrote about rebranding opportunities and retail positioning. She even attached a mock-up of a label she had designed, sleek, pale, soulless. It didn't say Rose Ridge. It said the Hartman Honey Company. I didn't respond. 2 weeks later, they came in person. Their car rolled up the dirt drive like something alien, gleaming too clean against the dust. When they stepped out, I realized how long it had been since I'd seen them stand here. The last time was the funeral. My mother wore a beige coat that didn't belong to this landscape. My father held his phone like it might get dirty. Avery took pictures before even saying hello. They said they were proud. They said they just wanted to help. They said we. Thomas was working near the shed when they arrived. He nodded politely but kept his distance, reading the moment the way he read the weather. Riley stood beside me, silent, her hands sticky with wax from labeling. They walked through the rows of hives, and I saw something flicker in their eyes, not wonder, not nostalgia. Calculation. They looked at the same wooden boxes that had once made them laugh, and now saw inventory. My mother pointed out the wildflower field. She said, "We could put a cafe here." My father talked about distribution. Avery suggested influencer campaigns, collaborations, limited editions. Their voices layered over each other like noise in a market. I didn't answer right away. I let them fill the air with their plans. I let them believe I was listening. It gave me time to see them clearly, the same people who had once called this place useless, now tracing profit margins in the dirt. Thomas met my eyes from across the yard. He didn't need words. His expression said everything. Careful. They'll call it family to make it sound kind. Inside the house, my mother touched the jars lined along the shelves, running her fingers over the labels as if they were her own handwriting. My father took pictures of the equipment. Avery stood by the window, her reflection overlapping mine in the glass. For a second, it looked like we were one person, the old version and the new one, before I stepped aside and broke the image. They stayed for dinner. The same table where their laughter had once echoed now held jars instead of wine glasses. They congratulated themselves for being here at the start of something. They spoke about our brand. I sat quietly and listened, just as I had that first night months ago. Only this time I wasn't shrinking. I was observing. Every word they said was another thread tying themselves to a story they had ignored until it was convenient. They weren't here to celebrate me, they were here to reclaim me. After they left, the house felt too quiet but not empty. I walked outside, where the hives hummed low under the stars. The air was cool enough to make my breath visible. I thought about the way they had looked at the land, how ownership, to them, was just a prettier word for control. Thomas came out from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He didn't speak, but his silence felt like a question. I answered without words by locking the shed and pocketing the key. Inside, Riley had left the kitchen light on. The jars glowed on the counter, each one holding a small, unspoken defiance. That night, I wrote in Grandma Rose's old notebook. I didn't write about honey or hives or yield. I wrote a single line. They weren't coming home, they were coming to claim. And I made a quiet promise to the hum outside that this time, no one would take it from me with a smile. Autumn arrived with that dry sweetness in the air, the kind that tastes faintly of apples and old wood. The fields around town shifted from green to copper, and every roadside sign started promising pumpkins, cider, heritage, pride. Around here, pride always has a booth. The Harvest Festival sits at the center of that pride. It is where the county lines up what it thinks is worth saving and says, "Look, we made this, we kept this alive." The dairy people bring cheese wheels wrapped in wax and tradition. The gardeners bring tomatoes the size of both fists. The orchard families arrive with crates of fruit, sorted by blush and shine. And then there is the honey table. I registered as Rose Ridge Honey Co. Independent Apiary. Under primary contact divided by owner, I wrote my own name, Lila Hartman. It was the first form in my life where I didn't pause before writing my name because I was waiting to see if there was space for someone else's above it. We set up early. Thomas hauled in the folding tables and repaired a splintered leg with a pocket tool he always carried. Riley arranged the jars and wiped them one last time with a clean cloth so each glass surface would catch the light. I had brought more than honey. I had brought frames to display, a slice of comb still intact, a printed sheet explaining pollinator health in plain language. People respect what they're taught to understand. The sign I propped in front of the table wasn't fancy. The wood was sanded smooth but still visibly old, the lettering hand-painted and honest, Rose Ridge Honey Co. Beneath that, in smaller script, owner and beekeeper Lila Hartman. I didn't add anything else. Not family business, not established by, not sisters, just the truth. Crowds move differently at a festival than at a market. At the farmer's market, people browse with a purpose. At the Harvest Festival, people evaluate. They don't just buy. They judge whether what you're offering is worthy of the story this county tells about itself. I could feel those eyes moving over the jars, over me, over the table. My hands were steady. I hadn't expected them to be. Before the judges made their rounds, the public came first. There is a certain expression people get when real honey touches their tongue. It's not an instant smile. It's a pause, a recalibration. You can watch it happen, like a lens focusing. I watched it again and again as strangers lifted tasting sticks, tasted, closed their eyes for a half second, and opened them a little softer, a little surprised. Each reaction landed inside me like an anchor. I wasn't floating anymore. I was rooted. Then I saw them. My mother arrived first, wrapped in a coat that looked more city than harvest, hair perfect, face prepared for cameras. My father followed, posture straight, wearing the kind of confidence men wear when they already believe they're on the winning side. And then Avery, in polished boots, moving like she already belonged in every frame that might be taken. They didn't ask if they could stand behind my table. They just did. Avery positioned herself at my shoulder and began offering honey samples to passing visitors as if she'd poured every jar herself. My mother started talking to anyone who slowed down long enough to listen. She used phrases like, our process, our bees, our sustainable line. My father hovered at the corner of the booth, nodding in a way meant to imply ownership without stating it. To the crowd, it looked seamless. Smiling faces, a united front, a wholesome origin story. To anyone walking by with a camera, it looked like a family enterprise. That was how they planned to rewrite it, not with argument, but with arrangement. Riley stiffened next to me. I felt Thomas watching from just outside the tent. He was not a man who interfered unless the foundation itself was at risk. Right then, I could feel him measuring whether we had reached that point. I let my mother talk. I let my father nod. I let Avery glide in and out of the frame like a marketing executive in a lifestyle spread. I let them settle into the center of a story they had not bled for, because I knew what was coming. After noon, the announcements began. The festival has a simple way of declaring what matters: a folding stage, a low microphone, a line of ribbons pinned to a burlap board. People stop what they're doing and listen. Pride freezes the air. They called categories in order: best heirloom produce, best preserved fruit, best artisan cheese. Winners stepped up, shook hands, smiled for photos. Each ribbon wasn't just decoration. It was permission to claim legacy out loud. Then I heard the words that made the air in my lungs go still: heritage honey, small batch, traditional method. The judge held an index card. His voice carried the practiced rhythm of someone used to being recorded. He announced the producer's name, the apiary, and the designation. The language mattered. This year's blue ribbon is awarded to Rose Ridge Honey Company, owner and beekeeper, Lila Hartman. There was a half second where I felt the ground under me click into place. No one else's name was on that card. Not my mother's, not my father's, not my sister Avery's, mine. The judge lifted the ribbon deep blue, edged with gold, and gestured for me to step forward for the photo. Just me. No family shot. No team behind the brand. Me. My mother moved first, an instinctive step like muscle memory toward spotlight. The judge didn't call her. My father straightened, waiting for his moment to be pulled in on the strength of proximity. The judge didn't look at him. Avery took one small step toward center frame, then froze when she realized no hand was extending to invite her. The cameras were already up. In that moment, I understood what real power feels like. It's quiet. It doesn't rush. It doesn't raise its voice. It simply refuses to include anyone who didn't earn their place. I walked to the front of the booth. The crowd turned. The judge pinned the blue ribbon directly to the wooden sign that read owner and beekeeper Lila Hartman. The pin slid through the grain, and I heard the faint crack of old wood accepting new weight. Flashbulbs popped. People clapped in that warm, communal way small towns clap when they've decided you belong to them. Behind me, I felt something collapse without a sound. It wasn't the table. It wasn't the tent. It was the version of the story my family had tried to build around me like a cage. The ribbon didn't just say best honey. The ribbon said rightful owner. From that second forward, they could stand beside my jars, but they could never stand in front of my name again. Spring arrived quietly, as if the land had been holding its breath all winter. The frost melted from the fence posts, and the ground softened under the first steps of morning. The bees began to wake before sunrise, crawling from their wooden chambers like tiny suns remembering how to burn. A year had passed since the festival. The ribbon still hung on the wall, faded slightly at the edges, but it was never about the color. It was about permanence. Proof that what I had built didn't vanish when people stopped watching. Rose Ridge Honey Co. had become a small, steady pulse in the county, not famous, not loud, but respected. Local cafes carried our jars. Children from the school visited to learn about pollinators. Sometimes I caught my own name printed in newsletters or posters, and it no longer startled me. The story no longer felt borrowed. It was mine. Riley came early most mornings. She worked without needing direction, her hair tucked into a scarf, her hands sure and patient. Watching her was like seeing a version of myself I hadn't known I could become: calm, competent, rooted. Thomas still helped when the hives grew heavy, though he talked less now. He didn't need to say that he was proud. Silence can hold approval just as easily as absence once held neglect. The letters started coming in winter. My mother's first, printed on crisp stationery that smelled of perfume and control. She said the family wanted to reconnect. She said they were sorry for past misunderstandings. She said we could move forward together. The words sounded as hollow as their laughter used to. My father's email came next. He attached a document, a proposal. He called it detailing an equity partnership between myself and the Hartman family. He offered investment, branding, publicity. He even listed projected profits. At the bottom, there was a line for my signature. I didn't sign. I didn't respond. Avery tried once more, sending an article about how family-run businesses thrive when past grievances are set aside. She wrote that she missed me. The message ended with a photo of the farmhouse she'd once called a ruin. The caption said, "Home should bring us all together." That was when I realized what revenge really means. It isn't anger. It's absence, the silence where your name used to be theirs to use. By February, I had finished the paperwork to buy out the final piece of the property that still listed my father's name. I paid in full, with money made from honey. The lawyer looked surprised when I handed him the cashier's check. Maybe he expected inheritance, or a man's signature. All he said was, "Congratulations, Miss Hartman. It's officially yours. I drove straight back to the farm. The wind moved through the bare branches, and I thought of all the years this land had been something borrowed, claimed, or dismissed. I opened Grandma Rose's old ledger and wrote one simple line on the inside cover. This land no longer carries your name. I mailed copies of the deed to my family that week. No note, no letter, just the proof. I haven't heard from them since. Freedom doesn't roar, it hums. It hums like bees over warm soil, like sunlight through the glass of full jars. It hums in the quiet, knowing that no one can rewrite your story while you're still holding the pen. Riley brought a group of students from the community college one morning. They stood in a circle near the hives while I explained how a colony works, the balance between work and rest, between gathering and giving. I told them how the bees build not from ambition but from need, how they don't take more than they can use. Some of them wrote it down like science. One girl looked at me like it was scripture. Later, when the students left, I walked along the fence line alone. The air was full of sound, the low buzz of the hives, the faint rustle of grass, the small heartbeat of something larger than myself. I thought about Grandma Rose, and how she'd planted flowers here not for beauty but for survival. Every color on this land had been earned. In the kitchen, the sunlight hit the jars stacked against the wall, turning the room gold. I took down one jar, the first one we ever bottled, and set it beside the open notebook. The handwriting on the first pages belonged to her. The handwriting at the end belonged to me. Between them was everything I had learned about loss, work, and ownership. I wrote a single final line at the bottom of the page. Revenge is not what you take, it's what you build when no one can take it from you. I closed the notebook. Outside, Riley's laughter carried on the wind, and I realized it was the first time the sound didn't echo against emptiness. Thomas's truck rumbled in the distance, the rhythm steady, like the pulse of the farm itself. The bees moved in their endless patterns, building, mending, continuing, never waiting for permission to begin again. I stepped out into the yard and lifted my face to the light. The air smelled of honey, earth, and something unnamed, not victory, not revenge, but peace. And for the first time, I didn't need an ending. I had one.